I am feeling a bit sick, actually. I don't know if you can see the cold sores on my lip from this day. I hope you don't. Anyway, I probably should have pushed this video a little bit further because I am still feeling a little bit under the weather, but I think I've put it off long enough, so let's get into it. So the last video I made before the kind of stretch of inactivity was the video about Stilfontein and all the issues surrounding the mining town after liquidation of the mine and all the things that happened as a result of that, the destruction of the community and all of that, but also the people coming together along racial lines and all of that. And after making that video, I also promised that I would be making a shorter video about solidarity to clarify some things, because the picture of solidarity in that video is not the whole story surrounding solidarity. So I wanted to make another video just to give the solidarity issue a broader, more holistic, well, not holistic really, but just a bigger picture, basically. And then I realized in the course of scripting that video and working on it that there's a lot of issues I'm going to have to deal with that concern the issue of race, for instance. And I don't know if you've noticed, but whenever I broach the subject of race in my videos, oftentimes it's with a kind of levity. A certain level of comedic distance is applied to the videos most of the time. There are maybe a couple of videos that I've done on the subject of race where I have been sincere and have drawn from personal experience and other things like that, and those videos aren't as heavily scripted as most of my other videos, and that's the videos that I titled A Letter to Young Black South Africans, and another one was titled A Letter to Young White South Africans. So that's the only time I've actually really looked at the subject of race in my videos in a sincere way. Outside of that, I often use the character of Sienki G, and it's very comedic. It's satire, obviously, and the character is supposed to be a black supremacist, but most of the time makes similar conclusions that white supremacists make about a lot of issues. Most of the time, not always. But, you know, having a problem with BEE, having a problem with Julius Malema, things like that. And it's supposed to be a comedic take on the whole thing, and it's supposed to... the fact that the character reaches different conclusions and wildly unexpected conclusions is part of the point. It's part of the shock. It's part of the juxtaposition and irony involved with the character. So, but also it's supposed to show how certain things that are ostensibly pro-black in South Africa tend not to be as pro-black as we might think. They might actually be anti-black in certain instances, or they might be using blackness as a cover for continuing to fail black people in a material sense. So it's just people paying lip service to blackness without actually doing anything profound to help the situation of black people in any way. And so part of the way that I express frustration, part of the outlet for that frustration that I have is the character of Sienki G. So a very complicated, very interesting character, if I do say so myself. But that's how I've mostly dealt with racial issues in my channel, or on my channel. However, to deal with the solidarity issue, I will have to get more sincere about this subject of race, and I'll have to become more, I suppose, serious about it, to discuss it in a more substantive way, in a less ambiguous way, so to speak. And that will require me to draw from certain personal experiences in order to find the right tonality with which to approach the subject on the channel. And that's not a fun thing for me to do, honestly. I'm using fun as an intentional way of, as an intentional understatement, shall we say. Because simply saying it's not fun makes it seem like I'm saying, well, I don't feel like talking about this subject, and that's the reason I've been inactive for about a month or so. But that's not really the case. When I say it's not fun, I'm intentionally being understated here. Partly because a lot of people that do talk about race in South Africa and seem to have an enthusiasm for it are people that often overstate almost every single thing they say. It's people that intentionally use bombastic and outsized language and dramatic language and a dramatic style in general to get their point across. And that's not how I want to tackle the subject, obviously. And so I want to do it a different way. Which is part of the reason why I suppose I'm using this understated language by saying it's not really that fun for me to talk about the subject of race. But what I mean when I say that is that I don't possess the enthusiasm that a lot of people who discuss race in our country, in a lot of mainstream outlets or even some independent outlets as well. Those people I don't have the same kind of energy towards the subject that they do. And part of the reasons why are very complicated. Part of the reason why I don't have this enthusiasm is because most of the times when I have had to become conscious of my race, it hasn't been great experiences. They aren't experiences that I would like to relive. And yet, to talk about the subject, I have to relive them in some capacity, one way or another, even if privately to myself, without expressing that to the audience. I still have to become very... I still have to go back to certain moments that aren't, again, fun to revisit. So, because of that, that's part of the reason why I don't engage with the subject in the sincere way that is the case in maybe like 2 videos that I've done. I don't often approach it that way, and that's part of the reason why. But another reason is that I don't want to be, the fact that now I have a Patreon and am making some amount of money from the channel and the content that I make, I don't want to be a content creator who somehow makes money by spinning terrible experiences into content gold or something like that. I don't want to directly take experiences that I've had or take some of the negative experiences that I've had and then turn them into content and then somehow justify economically, I suppose, them having happened in the first place. By, in a sense, saying, well, at the end of the day, I can now make money out of talking about those experiences. I can somehow monetize the terrible racial experiences that I've had. And because doing that somehow justifies them in a way, or it makes them somehow worthwhile. And I don't know, I feel like that's a perverse incentive to have for someone who ultimately is trying to deal with these issues at an individual level, but in an attempt to address them at a societal level as well, to say that we should have less and less issues that are like this. Because to say that we should have less and less issues that are like this while you make money in some way off of talking about those issues may it may give you perverse incentives to start, I don't know, to start seeing certain things where they aren't, for the sake of having yet another experience that you can monetize. The whole idea of our economic structures and how they function and what sorts of things can be turned into money can be very, very perverse at times. And so in a way, I've been grappling with all of that, with how to approach the subject, not turn it into content and in a way that economically sanctifies or in a way that economically sanctifies or justifies it, by way of saying, well, now you've managed to monetize it, so maybe it's good that those things happen because, hey, now you can sustain yourself on Patreon by talking about the horrible experiences you had, and then couch it as an education or something. Like, that whole structure just feels somewhat wrong for me. So I've been wrestling with that in a way, to reconcile the fact that I have to draw from some of these personal experiences to set the tone for how I'm approaching race on this channel, but also I don't want it to set perverse incentives for me, where I start now turning those things into content on an industrial level, as far as my channel can participate in that, as far as my channel can produce that, That's not what I want to do. I don't want to sell a sort of conveyor belt of terrible racial experiences to people that might have a guilt about those things and therefore want to pay me for, I don't know, for problems that they feel their community might have produced or something like that. It's just, that whole thing seems bizarre to me. More than bizarre, in fact. Bizarre is yet another understated way of describing just the conflict of interests that I sense going into those topics. And so I've had to think really long and hard about the balancing act of those things, because I am still going to be talking about racial issues. To be sincere about it, I will have to be drawing, for tonality's sake, from some of my experiences. But I also don't want that to be what makes me money and the bread and butter of my content or platforms or channel in their entirety. So I will be doing other things as well, of course, but because that's what I've been doing anyway, right? But I just want to make that clear, to say that I'm engaging in these subjects as much as I need to be making a living as well, and as much as I appreciate being able to have the support that I have on Patreon, and I hope to grow as well. The potential is limitless, truly speaking, the potential for growth. So I want to embrace all of that, but at the same time, I don't want it to be on the basis of very perverse incentives. I want to talk about some of these issues because I think they're important, not because I think I should be making a living off of them, because they are not subjects that we should, in the most ideal society, be living with. We shouldn't be living with those issues in the first place. So In keeping with some of the things that I said in the earlier video about how I want to talk about race in a different way and through different means than we are usually used to as participants of the South African conversation around race, I want to look at a video and react to it. It's a video by the YouTube channel Kidology. Now, you may or may not have heard of this YouTube channel, but as soon as I get into this video, you will immediately understand why I'm talking about it. So without further ado, let's watch the video.
I know this for a fact. When shit generally hits the fan, if you're not super well integrated to that community to the point where you guys are symbiotic, listen, tribalism kicks in like this.
Real quick.
Tribalism kicks in like this.
Real quick.
Along family lines, along racial lines, along ethnic lines, along nationality lines. Who's a refugee, who's not. Even the way that they talk about these refugees, they're like, well, these refugees are different. They look like us, they sound like us, so we can accept them. Like, the news coverage has been creepy like that.
Yeah.
So
if this shit happens in Quebec, you think the English people are not gonna go back of the bus?
Yeah.
This is Quebecer town right here.
yeah, I already...
Okay.
Salutations and welcome back to my channel. My name is Kidology and I make videos about everything and anything to do with modern society. So today we're going to talk about something a bit more personal, because I know some of you like my more personal, chatty, story time genre of video. And it's also something that relaxes me and is quite therapeutic, so I thought, why not? Especially as I have just gotten soaked by the rain outside and I need something to warm and cheer me up. So none of this is scripted, so do bear with me, but I thought it would be quite interesting to...
I'm just distracted because I think that that's a similar wall. Similar looking wall.
talk about tribalism and about tribes in general, because I think when I moved to the United Kingdom from my original native country, South Africa, I was under the illusion that I would leave tribalism behind, that I was moving into a progressive, multicultural and also individual-minded context and part of the world where...
Well, I mean, I would say that we are multicultural, even in South Africa. So that's the one thing that I think I'd push back on a little bit there. I think we're sort of similar in that context.
What I had grown up with would no longer sort of define who I was. And boy, was I wrong. So for a bit of historical context, especially for those of you who don't know, I am originally from South Africa. I was born...
Whoop, whoop.
Born in South Africa, and I lived there until I was 16 years old, at which time I was given a day's notice and informed that I was moving to the United Kingdom to live with a new guardian. And a consequence of that was that I had to very hastily and suddenly and without warning leave the boarding school that I had been living at for the past 2 and a bit years, and I came to the UK.
So here she's just laying out the situation, so I don't want to talk over her too much, although for the rest of the video I will be doing a lot of commentary, but on this part she's just laying down the groundwork, so I don't want to interrupt too much. After which, when she gets to the meat of the issue, that's when I'll jump in.
Was because I wanted to go back to my boarding school. And I think the reason why I wasn't homesick is because of my experience with my tribe. I'm not necessarily sure about South Africa right now, as I have regrettably never gone home since moving to the UK.
That's interesting though. I don't think a lot of South Africans, especially expat South Africans...
Well, actually, they're all immigrants. It's just that white people came up with this word expat, so they don't have to call themselves immigrants abroad, because that word is reserved for brown people.
...would put regrettably having not gone back home. I don't think they would use that word. Maybe when it comes to people that wanted to come back home but couldn't because of COVID restrictions, then I would understand that. But in terms of, in general, having sentiments of wanting to go back home. Nah. A lot of expert South Africans, not all of them obviously, but a lot, are quite bitter about the situation in South Africa, and they are happy enough to have left. And I don't know, they seem to be. It's weird because you might think that they're content where they are, but usually that would express in the form of not caring about South Africa anymore and not talking about it anymore. But we do get a lot of expats whose entire personality is to be angry about South Africa, so they still talk about it despite the fact that they seem to have found safety wherever they are. This is not all expats, by the way. There's some that are fine, you know. There's some like her who say that regrettably they haven't been able to go back home, but it's just something that I haven't come across, especially lately, from South African expats on the internet especially.
UK. I haven't left the UK at all, but at least when I was growing up in South Africa, tribes were significant and were very, very important, particularly where I lived, in which I basically lived in the home province of my tribe. I am a member of the Zulu, or the isiZulu tribe, the largest tribe in Southern Africa, a tribe...
Well, the Zulu would call themselves a nation, but yeah.
Which came to power in the 1800s behind the incredibly destructive but also great and magnificent battle and strategic and ethnographic changes made by King Shaka Zulu. My relationship with the Zulus is a very bitter one, at least from my end. It is one that I don't, at least now, blame the Zulu nation for, because...
Oh, there you go. She said nation. So she knows her roots. She knows.
I am coming to terms with and do understand the significance of tribalism and what it means to people and how it gives people meaning. And I believe that at this point in my life, when I see somebody being a part of a tribe, whether that be an actual ethnic tribe like the Zulu Kingdom, or a tribe such as your university that you have their merch for and you support them when they go up against other universities at sports games or what have you, I think that's very important. And I think that that is incredibly meaningful, to the point that it's more meaningful than even the individual when it comes to actually giving people a sense of purpose. And I say this because I think I'm an example of what happens when that is absent. I think that that just ends in a lot of bitterness and also a lot of ambiguity in terms of knowing where you stand in the world and in relation to other people, and especially in relation to other people who look like you, but when you're looking at each other, you don't see sort of yourself, you don't see a mirror image of you in them, you don't feel that sense of togetherness, that sense of pride, that sense of sort of knowing something that outsiders don't know, if you get what I mean. For those of you who don't know, when I was a child, I was born to a mother who didn't want me. I don't think she could have. She was, a drug addict, prostitute, all those sorts of things. And so I obviously was not planned. I wasn't wanted. So I sort of came into the world not being wanted, was immediately abandoned, was immediately put into foster care.
The Roe v. Wade situation, man. I don't know. It just made me think about the Roe v. Wade situation when she said that, because I think one of the things they might be going for is contraception as well. So, yeah, but it has nothing to do with that, obviously. It's just a thing that was in the back of my mind as well while she was saying what she was saying. Anyway.
Was immediately sort of stripped away from my, I guess, heritage in a way, from my language and from my cultural influences, which I think very much informs sort of the person that I am today. I'm not entirely sure why actually, but I do feel guilty about it. But whenever I sort of very subconsciously and without much thought walk past the mirror or look in a mirror, I get a bit of a shock because I realize that I'm black. And this may sound absolutely bizarre, I know. When I say it out loud, it sounds incredibly bizarre. But even when I sort of imagine my life and project
Okay.
myself into my future, or even sort of project myself back into the past, looking at memories, the good and the bad, what have you, I always imagine a little white girl or a grown white woman. And I do think that this has a lot to do with how I grew up. I think the most profound thing that has very much influenced this
That is very bizarre. Yeah.
image of myself which I have in my mind.
It's quite interesting, though. I understand why it's happening, or at least I think I understand why it's happening on the basis of, the rejection and all of that, but it's fascinating to hear about. Anyway, let's listen to the rest of it and piece this whole thing together more, I guess, responsibly.
Of being a white individual is to do with the fact that when I was fostered and adopted and then, well, due to circumstances, fostered again, I was only raised by white South Africans, is that I only spoke English and Afrikaans. I never spoke my native language. I never learnt or spoke Zulu. And a huge component and part of my life growing up was that whenever...
Like how she says English and Dutch. I guess that's a shorthand to help people understand what Afrikaans is, for those who may not be familiar with Afrikaans as a Dutch descent. Yeah, okay. English and Afrikaans socialization. Okay.
I encountered somebody who was black, they would inevitably speak to me in Zulu. And I think this is where I guess I put a bit of blame on myself. Well, definitely I put blame on myself. I didn't even try. I didn't even try to...
Okay, yeah. I mean... Yeah, okay, yeah, I get that.
learn the basics of just saying hello, how are you in Zulu, even when I was at an age where it was perfectly easy for me to do so, to just go out, find another little black kid somewhere and say, look.
Wow, yeah, that is quite... I mean, I want to say extreme, but also probably being abandoned and, not wanted and all of that. That's also probably an extreme situation as well. So, and in comparison, it's probably milder. So, yeah, but...
Teach me how to say the basics,
Okay.
Just so that life can be easier for...
I knew it. Yeah, teach me how to doogie. That's what that sounds like. Yeah, that's what that sounds like.
me
yeah.
and for others, that I can show respect to other people. I didn't even do that. I definitely had this complex in which I perceived myself to be white. And as a consequence of perceiving myself to be white, why would I learn Zulu? Why would I even try the basics when I speak perfect English and I'm cultivating perfect English?
That's, you see, now that's interesting to me. She says there that the reason why she didn't want to learn a single word of Zulu is because she had been rejected by, her Zulu mother, and therefore felt that rejection and therefore rejected in return. That's interesting to me, because is that the only reason why she wouldn't learn Zulu if she can speak English? Because what I'm thinking is, if someone was rejected from an English household, for example, or from an English family and ended up at another community in South Africa, they would still have to learn English at some point if they wanted a job, if they wanted to go to university, if they, if you wanted to do any of the things that require an auxiliary language in South Africa, for the most part, that language will probably be English. So if she was kicked out of an English family at the very beginning, she probably still would have found her way back to English. I think part of what is going on here is that isiZulu is not so standardized as a language for any of the things that she needed. It's not standardized and it's not necessary for her education, whereas English was. It's not standardized nor necessary for anything even beyond that. And so, like pop culture, movies, etc., you can just watch movies from overseas and learn about a lot of things that come from overseas to facilitate this cultivation of English and the English language. So I think part of it has to do with the fact that isiZulu and other native languages aren't as standardized or aren't as important, so to speak, as English in a way. I also think that part of it has to do with her being raised by white English South Africans, because white English South Africans, for the most part, they don't try to learn a lot of the native languages of South Africa. They are pretty content to be speaking English, maybe a bit of Afrikaans, if ever, but they're pretty fine just speaking English. And so I think part of it is also the upbringing, that she was being raised by white South Africans who were, in a very strong sense, like she said, socialized by English and Dutch. You know, she got English and Dutch socialization. So being socialized by white South Africans who were English, it meant that they were probably just going to focus on that. And they weren't going to extend, because in general, that community doesn't tend to extend itself beyond that particular language or that particular culture and cultural identity and things like that. So I think it's more than just her at play here. I don't think it's just her saying, I reject my Zulu upbringing or whatever. If the things she needed to study in school or university were in Zulu, she would have to learn Zulu regardless of the fact that she had been rejected by a Zulu mother, right? But that's not the case in South Africa. And so I think there's a lot more going on here than the mere fact that she felt like she should reject her mother and her mother's culture as a, one good turn deserves another sort of thing. I don't think it's all just down to her. Maybe a small part of it, a small part of this whole situation has something to do with that, but it is just a small part. I think there's a lot more that has to do with larger structures surrounding the individual.
When I speak Afrikaans, and enough Afrikaans that I can have a pretty meaningful conversation. And so whenever somebody would come to me, which would happen all the time, especially because I was always the single black person with white people, namely white adults who were raising me and trying to turn me into, the perfect little protege of what a black person potentially could be if they,
Oh my gosh. Okay. I don't think she's necessarily trying to criticize those people negatively. I think she's just, expressing her perception here.
I have the right Christian upbringing. I would always be approached by Zulu people who would come to me and say the typical "Sawubona, unjani," or something along those lines. And my response would always be, "I'm sorry, I don't speak Zulu."
Oh my God! Stop your fucking lying.
Yeah. I can imagine.
And this caused a lot of issues. The interactions would either end in them continuing to talk to me in Zulu because obviously I was disrespecting them and I knew that it was disrespectful. It was definitely not the approach that ought to have been taken, but nonetheless I took that path. Still to this day, it's quite an interesting phenomena that I would, for instance, be, let's say, at a corner store with one of the white women who was raising me at the time, let's say, and I was just with her, And because this was just a sight to behold and just a very odd sight, somebody would come up to me and say something to me in Zulu. And I would say, I'm sorry, I don't speak Zulu. I only speak English or Afrikaans. And at least as little as 5 minutes later, every single person who was in this environment.
Yeah. Also, you know, I sort of wonder as well what kind of, like, what ramifications this had for the white parents or guardians that were raising her. Because surely that may create some suspicion from all the other Zulu people as to what this white lady is trying to accomplish with raising this this Zulu girl. Is it even, because Zulu is not like a genetic category, so I don't even know if she even counts as Zulu anymore, you know. But I don't know, Zulu descent girl. Anyway, when they look at these white people raising this person and raising them not to speak black languages and not to even understand what they're saying and to actually respond to them by saying, I do not speak Zulu, I wonder what they're thinking, because they, in their mind, surely they're like, this is just a kid. This is a child. But these white people, however, they are trying to program some of our youth literally away from our customs and traditions and all of that. It's just, I wonder what conspiracy theories may have been inspired by this situation and may have been directed at the white parents, which may not be a very safe environment. I don't know, but anyway.
Would know that I didn't speak Zulu and would know that I had been the disrespectful one who had not responded to an elder in Zulu, who had spoken disrespectfully and who only spoke English, and who was holding the hand of a white woman. And I mean, obviously, the white woman who I was with wouldn't even acknowledge the existence
Oh, that makes it even worse. That makes it even worse.
of the Zulus around. So, you know, she would just go on her merry way. And I think it was inevitably because the dynamic was so strange, in which I would find that the black people, the Zulu people in the situation, in every situation, had such respect for the white person who was my guardian or my adopted parent.
I should have known. I should have known. I actually should have known. Because this is what I talk about. This is what I talk about. The internal inferiority complex, where they're happy enough to harass a black kid, but they will not breach the respect or anything with the white parent. I should have known. I should have known.
Such respect, because there was just this ingrained notion that white people are superior to black people. And
Yep. One which black people definitely internalized to a large extent, in a way that I don't think white people are even aware of nowadays. But it persists, for sure.
you know, it was just obvious, like, to everyone. But in my mind, I was also white, and I therefore expected the same kind of respect. But obviously, in their eyes, I was a little black girl who was like nothing. Right?
Yeah. So they, whatever frustrations they have or suspicions or bad feelings about the situation they have, they can take it out on the black girl, but not on the white parents or whatever, white guardians, you know. Yeah. I should have known.
Nice. So that really messed up a lot of the social expectations that we all had. And because my white guardians obviously didn't understand what was going on, because in their eyes, I was like them. I mean, they saw that I was black, but I was their little thing that they had been raising as a white child. It therefore didn't make sense to them, and they didn't really see it, if that makes sense. I remember so many instances. I remember once I was at a dinner. I was obviously the only black person there and everybody else was white. In South Africa, housekeepers or maids are all black. You'll never see a white maid or a white gardener or garden boy in South Africa. It's very, very much.
Hey, I remember that. The coconuts. Yeah, I remember this show. Yeah. The black maid wakes up white. Yeah, well, there's a switch and everything. Yeah, I remember this show. No, it's an okay show, I guess.
Divided on socioeconomic in relation
It had its moments.
to and equating to racial lines. So I was at this dinner and gosh, I can't believe I'm sharing this. Oh well.
There's actually an episode of Come Dine With Me South Africa where a guy kind of hires white women to dress up in domestic gear, and then for the whole night, basically, they're the domestic workers. Obviously, he just hired them to make this joke or something. He wanted to shock the other guests or whatever. But the reason why that would happen in the first place is because usually it's the other way around. Usually it's the white people that have black helpers, either working in the garden or in the house or anything like that. And this has been the case for a long time in South Africa and still continues to this day. I mean, my grandmother used to be a domestic worker in this sense, but this is still something that's going on to this day. So
Everybody was served food, the first course of a meal, and I realized after everybody had been served their meal and had started eating that I had not been given food. And I think everybody at the table thought, what's happened? It's just, a delay in the kitchen or whatnot. But it very soon became apparent that actually the maid was not going to serve a black child food. And at the time I didn't understand this, but now I do understand this.
which is very interesting, right? This is what I'm talking about when I talk about some of the inferiority complexes and what has been internalized and all of that. But aside from that, I think part of the conversation here is that they are seeing this kid as black, but not only black, they're seeing this kid as black in the context of their culture as well. And elders serving children within our cultures, is kind of, unless it's exactly like your parent or your mother or something, then it makes sense. But if someone has been hired to serve people food and they're serving a kid, well, then that's a bit of a problem, right? Unless it's at a wedding or something like that, But as a person who just works in someone's house and then you do that, it creates a problem. And this is part of the reason why there's some tension, and maybe we'll talk about this topic in another video, but there's a lot of tension between black families and black, especially South African maids. There tends to be some clashes sometimes, either between the kids and the maid and what they expect the maid to do for them and the maids won't do because they're kids, or whatever else, there tends to be some tension, or between the women of the house and the maid in terms of cleaning styles. The maid may have a particular kind of cleaning style, and the woman of the house was raised as a young girl, she was cleaning a lot, and so they may have differences of approach or style or whatever the case may be, whereas that doesn't really happen if the maids work for white families, because a lot of those young girls didn't grow up cleaning as much or whatever the case may be. Not all white families, of course. There's some farm-based white families that are doing everything for themselves, where the kids are being sent into halls to pull cattle out or to pull calves out or something like that. There are those white families, but mostly suburban white families, it's the maids that do all the cleaning, and so there isn't a clash of styles in a way, because the people that are hiring this maid don't particularly have a style themselves. So there tends to be tensions between black families and black maids that they hire in ways that don't happen when it's a black maid and a white family, because that relationship has been built up and cultivated for many years. But with a rising black middle class and them and the women in those families getting maids, it's starting to create new relationships, new relations. And sometimes if the maid is older than the women who hired her and they're both black, there can be a lot of clashes around respectability and all of that stuff. So it's a fascinating conversation to be had, that's for sure. But in any case, I think part of that is what's going on in this scenario, where this woman is not going to serve a child. It's not so much that they are considering themselves as inferior in this scenario. I think they actually are recognizing the child as one of them, and they're saying, I'm not going to bend my posture to put a plate on the table for this young kid. I mean, the kid should be serving me, you know. So I think that here it's more of the Zulu people recognizing this kid as their own, and not so much a case of an inferiority complex, although, you know, there might be some elements of that, but I think they're in the periphery of this particular incident.
And she outright refused to make me food until the white head of the table actually really went at her and scolded her for not serving me food. And then with a lot of begrudging anger, she served me food. But it was definitely something that humiliated her incredibly. And at the time, I definitely did not understand that. But now, looking back, I do understand how peculiar and how disrespectful that was, of a certain race already being so disrespected just in the general context of having to serve another race in the context of South Africa and apartheid and all that. So
on top of all of that, within your own culture, you're perceiving the child as a child, and then you are being instructed as a fully grown woman who probably would have been parenting this child in a different context, to now, you know, bend your posture and give this child and serve this child as the child's servant. You know, that's. But how interesting is it? How intriguing is it that it's happening with these racial dynamics? It's just so, because the outcome here is that a black, you know, woman would rather be serving everybody else than a black kid, you know. So it's weird how that manifests. And these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about, the kinds of tensions that I'm talking about, that aren't necessarily exactly just perfectly described whenever you talk about white supremacy. That's not, talking about white supremacy in and of itself just doesn't dig deep into the other dynamics that are a result of white supremacy, perhaps, but don't necessarily, they aren't just about it. It's a unique other kind of analysis that you have to display here in terms of the tension between this black person and this other black person, the differences in their age, the differences in their cultures, all of which, like the main drama is happening between two black people, essentially. And it's just happening with the backdrop of white supremacy egging on some of these tensions. But the real drama in this scenario, in this situation, in a more immediate sense, is happening between two black people. And this nuance, this is what's missing from a lot of context about talking about racial issues in South Africa. There's too much simplicity in this subject, which is weird, because based on the amount of importance that's given to the subject, you think it would be attacked with a certain sophistication and degree of genuine curiosity. Instead, we intentionally suck all the nuance out of this conversation. We flatten it out and make it much more convenient, or at least the people that usually talk about this topic are the ones that flatten it out and make it convenient for the purposes of their own narrative. I mean, honestly, it's so important, yet we don't treat it with the deference it deserves based on how high we rank it in our conversations, in our political consciousness and awareness. And I honestly think that part of the reason why that is the case is because we know that if we were to be as complex about this topic as we are supposed to be, we would all come out a little bit embarrassed from the conversation. You know, none of us would come out clean, so to speak, okay? So instead, we rob it of any complexity whatsoever so that it can be clean enough for political discourse, especially one-sided political discourse where each one is trying to push whatever agenda they have with this particular topic. But if we became a little bit more complex with it, we would realize that it's embarrassing for all of us. It's embarrassing for all of us, not to the same degree, or I'm not even saying that there's moral equivalence in any of this, okay? But I am saying that if we talk about it more complexly, then there is a chance that things won't be quite, I'm trying not to be poetic here, but things might not be as black and white as we make them out to seem most of the times when we talk about race.
Was definitely something that I was always in contact with, that feeling of not being a part of my tribe. And because of that, I really hated my tribe. And the feeling was mutual. At school, I wasn't integrated with the black students. They would realize that I didn't speak Zulu, especially the older students would then have conversations with me in Zulu, knowing that I didn't understand, but would just keep going and keep talking. And they knew that it was making me angry. They knew that it was making me hate them even more.
Yeah, I can imagine. That was on purpose. At a certain point, it's just antagonistic.
And it really just got to a point where I had absolutely nothing in common and felt that I had nothing in common with my tribe.
I mean, she was probably a fascination at a certain point, I'm sure. It started to become something of a freak show, I'd imagine, which touches on another aspect of race and culture and all these other things, about how we oftentimes assume that a certain culture has to have a particular kind of race, but that's not necessarily the case, right? Culture and race are not exactly the same things, and they have differences and they can be crossed, right? Yeah. Racial bounds, or rather cultural lines and all these things can be crossed on a racial basis, for sure. I mean, the fact that I'm speaking English right now is proof of that. So, yeah. But probably a conversation for another time. Again, in South Africa, whenever we talk about, it's so important, this conversation of race, but every time we talk about it, it's only in the most simplest terms imaginable, the most convenient, flattened form of the conversation is what we're going to have.
I had no sort of association. And I think to this day, I still definitely feel that I have no association. But then I look into a mirror and it sort of really stands out to me that, oh, you know, I am Zulu, you know, like I look at my nose, I have a very, very typical Zulu nose, it's quite obvious that I'm Zulu.
Yeah, be careful now. Okay. All right.
I think it's very important for people to feel like they're a part of a tribe and part of something in an authentic and genuine way. I can see how important tribes are to people, even if they are sort of very informal or quite new tribes or new kinds of tribes, such as communities on YouTube, such as aesthetics that people follow. It really gives a sense of purpose and direction that I don't think the state of existence which I find myself in is capable of giving in quite the same way, in quite the same depth. The reason why I, for instance, missed my boarding school was because it was the first time in my life where I actually had a place. And it wasn't that I was a part of a tribe, but I was in quite an exceptional situation where I was the person who united two tribes.
Okay. She's sort of like the avatar. I remember something like this as well with myself, although it wasn't about you uniting. Oh, I guess in a way it was. There was a time when I was in hospital as a kid, and I was in hospital with two other boys. Well, many people, but I got along with these two other boys that were around my age. And one of them was a white kid, and one of them was a black kid, and he was Tswana. So and I was the only one between the two of them who could speak both English and Setswana, and my own native Xhosa, of course. But so we would hang around, the three of us, and we were such a closely knit group of hospital buddies, let's say. But yeah, this guy would always speak in Setswana, and I would have to translate to him what this guy was saying. I'd have to translate to him what the white guy was saying, and then the white guy would always be speaking in English, so I'd have to translate in Setswana for my Setswana friend to understand. And that was kind of our dynamic. And we were, I mean, this doesn't seem to bother us so much. It also wasn't too much of a fascination. I mean, at the beginning, it was kind of like, oh yeah, this guy had never ever been friends with a white guy, and this white kid had never ever been friends with a black kid. And I was in the middle who had gone to schools that were sort of mixed. And so I was kind of the translator for both these people and sort of bringing them together in this friendship, and it was the glue. If I was not there, this friendship would not have happened at all between the two of them. So yeah, there's something of an intermediary position that some of us play, especially those who understand native languages and the English language as well, and so kind of understand both worlds to a certain extent, enough at least that we can translate different intentions to both parties. I don't know if this is actually my purpose or my place in the social hierarchy of South Africa or something. I don't think that that's the case, but it's just interesting that this is something I can somewhat relate to with this, with the, what can we say, like self-proclaimed coconut in a way. Yeah.
Let me explain. My boarding school was a very interesting place because it was about 60% black, 40% white. And it was a huge school, huge school. At my school, it was quite evenly divided between the two dominant races.
We're all friends, except we're the Indians. Where's everybody else? Where are the coloureds? That's the South African story again. That's another trope of talking about race in South Africa. For the most part, it's relegated to talking about black and white. Like I said, you know, we take it to black and white terms so often, and yet we believe that we're having some of the most important insights and most important conversations around this topic, but we treat it so so basically, we put it in such simple terms that it's oversimplification to the point where nothing of substance is really, or I wouldn't say nothing of substance is ever said, but things of substance are rarely ever said, because we are not expressing any kind of ingenuity or genuine deep curiosity whenever we unpack this conversation. For the most part, yeah, it's just black and white.
And for the first time, it was very apparent to me that all the whites were with one another and all the blacks were with one another. But inevitably, being in boarding school, for the first time, blacks and white students had to live together and had to live in the same environment and had to somehow come together and relate to one another and make living together bearable. And
so let's find a way for union without adult supervision. Yeah. Yeah.
make it work. And I think because there wasn't that adult influence, it made this a lot easier for reconciliations to be made, not having the influence of parents, especially because a lot of parents, well, obviously grew up in apartheid, but also because it meant that we had to think for ourselves. And when there was something wrong, we had to come up with solutions. Because I was black on the outside.
See, this is what I mean. Like, because I was black on the outside. Look, I don't like the use of the term coconut or whatever, but hey, she introduced it with the, talking about the sitcom, and now she's basically describing it here. So, black on the outside.
I fit in with the black cohort, the 60% black cohort, but I also spoke not just English, but white South African. I knew sort of their vibe, if we could put it in crude terms. And so whenever there was an issue, which there always was, I would sort of be the person, the go-between.
I can relate to that.
In a way, and also just quite a unifying force.
Well, I mean, I don't think I personally would say something so grandiose. I think that's a little bit too rich for my blood.
I was very good at changing for certain situations, very good at being sort of colloquially African, colloquially black for certain people, and then being, a fun, rebellious white South African for some, and then being a very proper white for others, and then being a bit, Afrikaans for some.
Really? A bit Afrikaans? Really? I'd like to know if she can actually speak Afrikaans. I wonder what that might sound like. I'm interested to know if she actually speaks Afrikaans.
And it sort of really allowed me to just move very easily. And I also found that it helped that my teachers really liked me. And they really liked me, I think, mainly because I was very different, and a lot of them were white and hadn't really experienced teaching a black student who spoke English like I did, or only spoke English, and it really helped. And so I guess in boarding school, that was the closest that I felt to being a part of a tribe. However, it was odd, and I would say that I didn't actually feel completely as if I was a part of something, because it became very obvious to me on a Friday when all of the predominantly white boarders would go home to their farms and their parents, that this wasn't, a real sort of tribe and family. They had other affiliations, more tangible, more concrete tribes and bloodlines to be associated with. I think also a consequence of being the person who was, I would say, the most popular at my school was that I also was very lonely in a weird sort of way. I guess when you're friends with everyone, you're sort of in a way friends with no one.
Yeah. In a way.
Because there's nobody sort of significant who you can confide in, who you can be friends with exactly, because there's sort of a bit of you in and with everyone. And I remember at our breaks that I would go from group to group, effectively just checking in, and it was more like I was ticking off a list, making sure that I'd gone to every group, checked in with everyone, made sure that this person was okay from yesterday when they'd come to me crying about something, that sort of thing. And so I served a very agony aunt sort of role, which I loved, but on reflection it was very common for me to actually go from group to group during a lunch break and then find that I could just go off by myself and I wasn't missed, and I also didn't really know where to go. And so that was a weird place to be in as well, but it was definitely a preferable place to be in relative to where I'd been in primary school, and that's for another video. I don't know, I think I'm just thinking of tribes and tribalism a lot more because I see it a lot, especially in Europe, and I think especially with everything that is going on in Ukraine and the vision that Putin and so many Russian leaders before him have had of finding that all-encompassing Russian identity, even if it means destroying the identities of others in order to realize a vision of a greater Russia.
Yeah. Again, we're going to get into... We're still going to expand on the conversation of the Russia-Ukraine war and its connection or its relation to Africa in a sense, and some of it will also be dealing with these questions of race and tribe, I suppose, and all of that. So we're still going to be doing that, for sure.
I think it's just very present, and it's just very obvious during these times.
I guess what I'm saying is that we're all thinking about this in part in this way. This is one dimension of it, and it's one I'd like to explore as well in the context of my particular platform and small channel.
In which everybody, I think, in modern societies is very angry and very much grappling with the conflicting aspects of individualism on the one hand and being an individual, and also being a part of something bigger, namely a tribe. And some tribes are definitely perceived as more important.
I mean, I don't know if it's as big of a clash from a non-Western perspective, and not just non-Western perspective, because many things are non-Western, you know. India is non-Western, Russia is in many senses non-Western, China is non-Western. So I just want to clarify that. But for me, I think that the dichotomy between tribe and individuality and all of that, I don't think it's as much of a strain or as much of a clash or as much of a frustration in an African, or at the very least, let me talk about a Xhosa, the way that I think about myself. In that context, it's not that much of a clash, because I understand myself as an individual, who I am. But of course, who I am as an individual begins at some point along the lineage of a history that has been happening and is bigger than me and all of that stuff. So, and that history that has been happening all along is, you know, the history of Xhosadom. But I mean, as a participant of that history, I also have a say in the story to some degree, and I have that say in my capacity as an individual as well. I don't know, it's very difficult to unpack, and I won't be doing it in this video, but suffice it to say, for someone like me, it's not that big of a clash, actually. I'm not that frustrated with this supposed dichotomy. So, yeah.
important than others in this day and age, and some are worthy of expression and identity and others are not. And I think this is causing a lot of problems and a lot of contention, especially as more firm and solid boundaries are being drawn between groups in order to reinforce their identity and their existence and authenticity.
I mean, that's part of why, but there are also other economic relations and broader political concerns that lead to the drawing up of borders, and then the idea of identity is like a secondary explanation on top of that as well. So yeah, but yeah, I hear what you're saying.
So it's an interesting time, even if it is a hard and unpleasant one. And I don't think it's necessarily going to go away. But I just thought I would give my little spiel about how I grew up with tribalism and my inability and also unwillingness to integrate or to actually be a part of my native tribe. It's like I've just been put into this illusion of being something which I'm not. But at the same time, when I look in the mirror and I see that something that I'm not, I'm also seeing something that I'm not. So there's just this disjoint, and it can be quite perplexing at times, and I do feel very detached from myself and also from other people.
Right, so that was just one way of thinking about and talking about the concept of race that hasn't been discussed in South Africa all too much, definitely not in a lot of mainstream platforms. And I think it's important because it brings a certain level of nuance and complexity, as I said, and it centers the conversation, at least in some way, around Black people working out issues of being Black, I suppose, in a way where the white supremacy is present and it's part of the background for this particular racial relations, but it's not how a lot of them manifest for a lot of Black people in their interpersonal relationships. For a lot of Black people in our interpersonal relationships, a lot of the issues and racial tensions that come our way come from within the community most of the time, you know. So that's just something I don't think we investigate well enough. And I personally think that it's important to investigate that because, for one thing, it makes the issues far deeper than they are when we discuss them in a lot of political platforms and political conversations and discussions and all of that. And the reason why it's important that the conversations are deeper than that is because we get better insights if we're investigating them at that level. And so this is not me trying to say that, you know, this is the end all and be all, the be all and end all, whatever the case may be. This is not me saying that this is the last word on such things, but this is me just trying to further extend the invitation of this particular video in a way to say that, well, let's talk about these issues, but let's talk about race relations in South Africa in a way that we haven't before, and let's confront not just white supremacy but Black inferiority complex and the tensions that can happen within a racial group that happen due to mechanisms that are unique to the conditions that are experienced within that racial group, but that they may be coming from a broader context of white supremacy and all of that, but that's not the main or even most interesting aspect of how these relations manifest within the group itself. There are much more interesting conversations to be had about how we as Black people are in a situation where we have Black leaders, Black politicians, Black presidents, and all of that, and yet Black people are still the most vulnerable community in South Africa, still the poorest South Africans, and all of that, and what that means in the broader landscape. Sure, as a part of the legacy of white supremacy, but also as an instrument or as an outcome of deeper ways that we need to talk about Black relations, intra-relations, more specifically. So, but hey, it's just a thought. I do think, though, that these are tough questions, but they are more important questions than we have been asking about race and about race relations in South Africa for a while now. And before I tackle issues of race and racial issues in the normal way that they're usually discussed, I just wanted to give you a taste of what could possibly be the character of such conversations before I discuss things like solidarity and things like the Russia and Ukraine war and all of that, and how it pertains to Africans and, in a certain way, race relations with Africans and all of that. So yeah, stay tuned for all of that. That's still to come in the channel in the future. But for now, this is all I have for you today. You can check out the video for yourself. I haven't featured the video in its entirety. There's certain parts of it that I've skipped, so you can go to the channel Kidology itself. I'll put a link in the description or put a link over here as well. And you can go check out the video yourself, maybe even check out the channel. It might be interesting, it might not, who knows, but certainly give the video a try. And also check out my Patreon. If you like this video, like, subscribe. I don't often make calls to action, but there we are. And I'll see you next time. Cheers. Attacked with a certain sophistication and degree of genuine curiosity, but instead for something so important. What? Let's go. Load shedding.